Thank you for joining us on our conversation about learning science and really thinking about learning science as we reflect on the past year with COVID. And we think about our learning environment at any school, at any higher ed institution, any age range, any teacher in any subject. This has been quite a tumultuous year. Now, my name is Simon Allen, and I'm the Chief Executive with McGraw-Hill. And I'm very proud to be joined on the panel today. And if you would imagine us sitting in a room together, if only, sharing a stage and perhaps engaging in this conversation together, we wish. But I'm joined by two very eminent learning science specialists and really experts in the field. Professor Bob Feldman is a professor of psychological and brain sciences at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Bob is also the senior advisor to the chancellor at UMass Amherst as well. He happens to be a longtime author of various psychology textbooks, of course, including with McGraw-Hill. And he is also chair of McGraw-Hill's Learning Science Advisory Board. And that's a very important board for our company in how we relate everything that we create, all of the content and material that we create, to ensure that it has and adheres to learning science principles to make sure we're improving outcomes and the learning processes of our student customers. I'm also delighted to say that we're joined by Tanya Jewston, and Tanya is Director of Digital Learning Research and Development and also co-director of the National Research Center for Distance Education and Technological Advancements at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Oh, it's a long title, Tanya. It's lovely to see you here. Tanya is also nationally recognized for her work in blended and online learning, and she's also a fellow with the Online Learning Consortium. Now, let me say a couple of things before we go to an informal conversation about a few specific areas. But for McGraw-Hill specifically, I did want to just take a minute and say that this past year has been quite a tumultuous time. It's been exciting and terrifying by the same measure. We've found that since really the end of March, we were in emergency mode, and we've really transitioned all of our staff to work on implementation. By that, I mean, we have been focused on doing nothing but helping teachers and instructors transform their courses to an online delivery model, where many of them are comfortable in that scenario, many of them are not. And our focus has been helping them with their material, putting their material on our platform, primarily McGraw-Hill Connect, and making sure that we are easing the process and the transition to this hybrid learning environment. Really, it's still very much a remote learning environment. We spent a great deal of time very early on in the summer creating products like McGraw-Hill Rise, which allowed teachers, particularly those within grades 3 to 5, assess the gap that their students, their children, had really developed over the COVID period, so that we tried to help them understand the gap that was there to make sure that we can close the gap and help continue the education process with minimal disruption. That's been our focus. I mentioned Tanya's affiliation with the Online Learning Consortium. All of our core McGraw-Hill implementation teams have been trained up with the Online Learning Consortium to make sure that we can help, hopefully in a very credible way, the instructors and the teaching community move to an online environment. I do not want to make this a commercial for McGraw-Hill, so apologies, but I did want to illustrate that as a pretty large company, and all of these things, of course, were done at no charge. As a large company, like many companies, we wanted to respond quickly and in ways that would be helpful to the community. And that's exactly, I hope, what we've managed to do. But of course, the situation continues. This term, this semester is no different. We're still very much in a hybrid learning mode. That will continue, we think, through the spring into the summer. Let's see what happens in the fall. But without further ado, let me, if I may, bring in our esteemed guests and begin a conversation around how we think that the principles of learning science will help us understand how to deal with this environment. And particularly, there are issues that concern us around equity. There's a significant equity gap that has not, it's always been in existence, but now it's perhaps broadened and widened even further. That's a concern. And obviously, the ability, part of that, with many of our lower income households where the gap is particularly a problem. These are some of the issues that we need to think through, as well as the principles of good remote learning. And I'm going to quote Tanya a few times on this, but the emergency remote instruction, as the way you phrased it and how that's developed, is a key issue. So if I may ask Bob, initially, we've just talked about the issue of equity and the really unfortunate effects that the pandemic has created in widening that gap. How do you think that some of our learning science principles might help us closing that gap and how we think about the equity issue?
Well, thank you, Simon. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and Tanya. Yeah, I think we're facing a perfect storm of inequity. In past major crises in the country and around the world, actually, the Great Depression, in terms of health, the AIDS crisis, in terms of the 2008 recession, minority communities were impacted far more than more affluent communities and majority communities. And I think you can talk about kind of digital poverty that many students are experiencing right now. They don't have connectivity, and this actually also applies to a rural-urban gap. They don't have the same degree of access to materials. They don't have the proper space to study. It's much harder for students of color to engage in online learning than it is for other students. And the other thing that's almost ironic about it is that statistically, if you are a student of color, you're more likely to be online as opposed to face to face, because just because of the way things have worked out in terms of logistics. So it's a very difficult situation, and I think it's incumbent on us to think about ways that we can support these communities. I think we've engaged in online learning, and I think Tanya will speak more to whether it really is online learning. We've engaged in it on an emergency basis, basically. We haven't thought through what are the right ways to do it. We haven't trained students and we haven't trained faculty. And so it's a very difficult situation, and I don't think it's going to go away at all.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. It's not going to go away. It's with us for a while. Tanya, any thoughts that you may have?
Yeah, and listening to Bob, it just made me think, I teach in the communication field, communication technology, and over the years, we'll talk about the digital divide. And it was sort of like, do you have dial-up? Do you have broadband? Do you have bigger broadband? Do you have 4G? Now we have 5G, like I can't even keep up. And so we thought the digital divide was leaving us, right? And so more people have access to internet, to mobile devices, to data, and these sorts of things. What happened in the sort of launching of the pandemic, which caused the situation, right, where we have remote emergency instruction. This was not a well-planned transition to virtual learning or to online or blended learning. This was a public health crisis in which we had to move things remotely in an emergency situation very quickly. And so they weren't necessarily strategic. We were sort of throwing things out there. But what we did notice first and foremost is that at the K-12 level, as well as even in the post-secondary level, we think that all of our students have devices and or have data or internet access, and that was not the case. So the digital divide is alive and well. And so that's the first thing that we know that institutions were faced with, was just figuring out how to get students access to their learning experience remotely. I think that sometimes we forget that there are, though, anomalies. There are cases of success throughout our country, even for students who are traditionally underrepresented or marginalized or disadvantaged. And I think we need to take some time to identify those success cases where students are actually doing better at a distance. And I've heard some of these stories. And so I think it's really important through research that we're not always looking at comparative studies and the numbers and those sorts of things, but we're capturing the stories from the different individuals that are out there. Now, traditionally, we think students are all digital natives, right? We got TikTok and Snapchat and everything and mobile devices. But that, and I don't really like the term digital natives to begin with, but we know that digital natives are a myth. We know from our own research at the Data Research Center that students may have these tech skills, but that doesn't necessarily translate to being able to work online. So we need to ensure that our students are ready for online learning readiness. We've been studying this for decades. So do they have tech access, and do they have access to an environment in which to study? Those are things we had sort of forgotten about, in 2020 until the pandemic joined us. And now we have this new flexible environment, right? So they're meeting maybe for a couple hours. Students have to know how to be organized, to find their stuff, to catalog their stuff. They need to schedule time in which to do work. And it's very hard during a pandemic, as Bob mentioned, all of these other socio-emotional sorts of things that we're dealing with. And the other thing is, we think we know how to communicate well online and socialize, but we don't necessarily. So students are now having to learn how to communicate with their peers, build relationships, communicate with their instructors, as well as we see this in higher ed. And while they're sort of scrapping through this, it's not natural to them. And so we need to do our best to ensure that they have the technology, they have the environment, they understand how to be self-directed. And on top of that, that they're able to not just effectively communicate about their activities and their classes, but they're able to build the networks. I mean, school is one thing we're not doing a lot of good right now is making school fun and a social place. And so our students are really lacking sort of the social emotional aspect.
Got it. No, that's well said.
If I may.
Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Yeah.
We know that kids are actually spending more time online with social media. And what they're getting is a very skewed view of what's happening during the pandemic. So rather than traditionally, we want students to talk to one another, and then they need to talk to one another and gain social support. They're actually ending up having less social support because of their higher uses of social media.
Yeah, and that actually becomes an equity issue, not just for, we think of the traditional achievement gaps and those sorts of things, but we know from our research that actually certain racial and ethnic groups prefer socialization. They have a need for socialization. I know as a low-income first-generation student, I needed to build those networks with my peers in order to figure out how to work through college, because none of my family or friends necessarily were making that same journey. So when we lose those connections, it really puts some of us who are from traditionally underrepresented groups at a disadvantage. So we need to make sure as educators and as institutions that we are doing more to ensure that students have those social emotional needs met, as well as all of those different skills I mentioned.
No, that's well said. And I'm curious to take another tack on this as well. That's a lot. I agree. I think everyone would agree about the students, how they've struggled through this process. What about the teachers, Bob? I'm thinking, as for you as a psychologist, what are you thinking about the teaching community? Because it's been a very challenging time for them as well to make this transition.
Yeah, it's been a real challenge, and I'm closest to college professors, and I know that they have been struggling with. First of all, they're teaching in a way they never expected to teach, and many of them actually had fairly negative ideas about what it's like to use online instruction. So all of a sudden, they're thrown into an environment where they have to use it. The training has been minimal, and instructors who are used to being experts are suddenly in a situation where they're novices and they're trying to teach effectively. They're trying to figure out how to do things the right way and engage their students. And it's been very, very challenging. And it's also been challenging. You find a difference between men and women. There's interesting data that for male professors, in some ways, they've been more productive, but there's been a definite decline for female professors in terms of their productivity because they are not only taking care of themselves and their work and their students, they're also taking on added household chores. We can obviously no one wants to suggest this is appropriate, but it's been very difficult for the faculty in terms of anxiety, and it's also been we talk about the students' emotional status, we talk about the faculty, but parents have become highly involved in their kids' education, and they're totally untrained. And sitting with a 5-year-old on a Zoom call and trying to get them to engage has been extremely anxiety producing. So we're seeing huge amounts of anxiety that we've never had before. Higher amounts of depression and even suicidal ideation has gone is far greater than it has been before. It's been very difficult, and we're usually you see people acclimating to stressors. In the case of the pandemic, people are actually showing higher levels of stress now than they did a year ago.
Yeah, it's very worrying. I can relate to some of your comments about female academicians, because within McGraw-Hill, as I think about our higher education and K-12 businesses, over 70% of our staff are female, and many of them have young children. And just as you say, whether it's appropriate or not, the reality is a lot of the childcare and the early years schooling especially falls upon that segment of our own company staff. And we've had to be very flexible in how we think about that, with encouraging people to take the time they need. They catch up, we rely on them, and they do always catch up work when they can. But it completely changes the nature of their day and adds to the stress, just as you described, Bob. Tanya, I'm curious to go back to something you said earlier as well about, and you were getting to an interesting description of what actually makes effective and efficient online learning, rather than this emergency situation that we're in now. How can we transform, do you think, from that emergency remote structure that we have into a somewhat more cerebral, thoughtful way of engaging longer term in remote learning? I know that's a very big question, but just briefly, what sort of measures should we be taking to succeed in that?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is for faculty and for teachers, some of the things that we've struggled with is a lot of us don't know how to teach online. We don't know how to design our classes effectively for the medium. We haven't gone through professional or faculty development in order to learn these skills. And what we have learned from the pandemic is that was not really well thought out strategic and designed learning necessarily. We were using what skills that we had and so forth in order to sort of put a Band-Aid on the situation. And what we do know is that from the pandemic, that replicating the face-to-face online doesn't always work well. And so having teacher-centered and faculty-centered instruction or more passive ideas about instructional approaches, we need to sort of move beyond those. Now, we do have over 20 years of solid research on effective practices that we can be implementing it. And even if you think back to the computer-mediated communication research, that goes back even to the 60s or the 70s of sort of what tasks should we be doing online? How are things structured? So we do have all of this research, and we have some great organizations that have quality indicators on how we should be designing and teaching our classes effectively. And really the pedagogy comes first, right? The technology comes second. So at Data Research, we've identified different quality indicators. The Online Learning Consortium, which McGraw-Hill is partnered with, and helping the McGraw-Hill staff better support instructors by helping them design their courses and include some of these effective practices to make sure that they're best serving students. And there's other organizations out there that can help as well, like Quality Matters, WCET, EDUCAUSE, and so forth. But at the end of the day, we need to think strategically moving forward. Blended learning is the way. So let's look at what works and what didn't work and integrate face-to-face and online more strategically, implementing some of these effective practices or research-based practices so that we can best serve students moving forward. And I think a key with that for administrators listening, whether you're university leaders or K-12 leaders, is that you need to provide time for your faculty and your teachers to learn some of these strategies and how to effectively use blended and hybrid learning pedagogies.
That's a great thought. Bob, any additional comments?
Yeah, certainly Tanya is absolutely correct in saying that we really have to be intentional about teaching faculty how to be good teachers. And we know, learning science has told us what good teaching is. Basically, good teaching is good teaching, and it doesn't matter whether it's online, face-to-face. The same general principles hold. We want high levels of student engagement. We want to hold high expectations for our students. We want to give them frequent and clear feedback. We know what makes for good teaching, and we can apply it. And I think if we are intentional about training faculty at every level how to do it, and also training students how to take online courses and how to engage appropriately, we're going to be much better off at the end of this pandemic than we were at the beginning. I cite a lot of negative statistics and problems, and we all see the problems. But I'm basically optimistic about the future. I think we can learn from this, and I know that a lot more faculty are open to online learning because they've now engaged in it. So I think the future of education is going to be very positive.
Yeah, I think we would all share that. I think getting through the initial emergency and then becoming what is hopefully will become a normal type of teaching process is something that we're all looking forward to. Tanya, in the minute or so that we have left, additional thoughts as if you think of the educators that hopefully are listening to us, any additional thoughts that you might have for them as they get ready for the next this semester and the following, let's hope in the fall, if things even up a little bit?
Yeah, I think just a few steps is thinking about what you really want your students to be able to demonstrate that they are able to do at the end of the semester. Backwards Design by Wiggins and McTeague is a great place to start. I think also too, thinking about what sorts of activities, learning activities take, place better online versus face-to-face. Some things we really need to keep face-to-face, some things that we don't need to. And I think integrating those different mediums, right, from the face-to-face online. I think if we start there in a proper design sort of approach and seek out some of these effective practices, we'll be in good shape. Bob had a really key point here. As faculty and or teachers, it's not about the sages on the stage anymore, right? It's about being the guide on the side. We have to structure learning and scaffold learning for our students at all levels in order to ensure that they have the academic challenge as well as the social interaction to move forward in their learning. And I think if we could keep that in mind, that we're structuring interaction for our students, whether it's with the content or with each other in group learning, it'll be a lot better place moving forward in beyond the inoculation, post-inoculation.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Well said. Bob, any final thoughts in the next half minute or so?
I would want to reiterate, I think, what both of us or what all of us are saying, and that is that we have to intentionally help teachers learn how to use the technology. We can't expect them to just go in and be able to teach without clear training. And I think actually this is where McGraw-Hill can, if I may, where McGraw-Hill can come in and provide instructors with the tools they need to be effective in the classroom.
That's great. Thank you, Bob. That's a nice lead in for me just to wrap up in a few seconds and say that thank you to both of you for really a helpful conversation. I wish we had more time and we're together. It's inherent upon all of us, McGraw-Hill, as well as all of your institutions, to do what we can to help teachers and students in this process for the next few months until we do get to post-inoculation. Thank you all for listening. I hope it's been useful. Bye-bye.